Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all this morning. I'm Matthew Taylor, I'm Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you for today's very special event. Just before we begin, a quick reminder to turn your mobiles to silent. We're filming today's event and live streaming over the web, so welcome to the many people I know who are joining us online. Our hashtag today is, and I say this with a certain amount of regret, RSA Brexit, if you'd like to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. The RSA is pleased to be collaborating with the Scottish Government to schedule today's event. We're proud of our affiliate organisation, RSA Scotland. The RSA is an active and growing fellowship in Scotland, and we're pleased to be working with the Scottish Government and Scottish local authorities on basic income, on inclusive growth, and in a number of other areas. So we're delighted to welcome First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola is currently MSP for Glasgow Southside. In government, she served as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing and then Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, with responsibility for government strategy and the Constitution. Nicola also served as Deputy First Minister of Scotland. She became leader of the SNP on November the 14th, 2014, and was sworn in as First Minister later that month. We'll hear from the First Minister this morning on the current state of play of the UK government's Brexit negotiations and the future of the UK in Europe. As we were just discussing, this is a speech that has obviously been worked on right up to the last moment. The format for this morning's event is that the First Minister will deliver her speech. I'll then rejoin her on stage for the discussion, and we'll have plenty of time for your questions before we wrap up promptly at 12:30. Please do note, however, whether you're journalists or RSA fellows, that the First Minister will only be taking questions relating to today's speech. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew, for your introduction. I should probably start today with something of a confession. For those of you who don't know and haven't read it, Matthew wrote a blog last week with the title, "Can Politics Ever Be a Source of Wisdom Rather Than Anxiety?" And that gives me a problem this morning. After all, I'm here to talk about Brexit, and any politician who talks about Brexit without a significant level of anxiety clearly doesn't have any wisdom. So that, I'm afraid, is a conundrum this morning. However, I will do my best to add some notes of hope and, who knows, perhaps even some words of wisdom in my remarks today. And let me say at the outset what a real pleasure it is to be able to do that in such a magnificent and, in many ways, appropriate setting. This room was designed by the Scottish architect Robert Adam, who, as many of you may know, also designed Bute House in Edinburgh, which is now, of course, the official residence of the First Minister. Robert Adam drew heavily on the lessons and traditions that he learned during his travels across Europe, and indeed this room was purpose-built as a venue for discussion and debate. And so, in some senses, it really does evoke the values of the European Enlightenment in which Scotland and this institution played such a proud part. These values continue to be reflected in the RSA's mission and exemplified in the work that you do. In fact, it is striking how many connections there are between the RSA's recent priorities and those of the Scottish Government on issues that range from mental health in schools to universal basic income to inclusive growth and support for fair work. So the RSA is in many ways an ideal host for a discussion about Brexit, an issue that will have profound implications for our economy, the shape of our society and our place in the world for many decades, indeed for many generations to come. Now, of course, in the interests of complete transparency, I should say that I come at the Brexit challenge from a very specific perspective, as does the government that I lead. We oppose Brexit, we strongly oppose Brexit and deeply regret it. Even now, our strong preference would be to remain in the EU. Scotland, after all, voted by 62% to 38% in favour of that outcome. However, since the vote took place, we have sought to recognise the result of the referendum across the whole of the UK, even if we don't always entirely understand it. And so for the last 2 years, we have put forward constructive suggestions on how Brexit might be implemented in a way that finds common ground rather than in a way that further deepens division. In fact, when the Scottish Government policy paper, Scotland's Place in Europe, was published in December 2016, it was, at that time, the first detailed set of proposals to be produced by any government in the UK. It preceded the Chequers White Paper by 19 months. It is fair to say, of course, that our proposals have not so far had the impact on the UK Government that we would have wanted them to have. The UK, throughout these negotiations, has shown little inclination to pay serious heed to Scotland, or for that matter to Wales, London, or to the different regions of England. Indeed, one of the lessons from our experience of the last 2 years, which I suspect has not been lost on the Scottish people and which will be remembered in Scotland for a long time to come, is the stark contrast between the EU's treatment of independent nations and the UK's treatment of devolved nations. The European Union has supported Ireland and shown it nothing but solidarity as it confronts the challenges of Brexit. By contrast, the UK has dismissed and ignored Scotland's concerns. So looking at the UK Government and the EU, it's fair to say that only one has looked like a genuine partnership of equals, and over the past 2 years, that has not been the UK. However, the Scottish Government is determined to continue to put forward constructive proposals and to exhaust all opportunities for compromise that would allow Scotland's interests to be protected. After all, the decisive moments of this phase of the negotiation are now upon us. Speculation, of course, is rife as to what will emerge from Brussels in the next few days. It's clear from developments yesterday, or rather the lack of developments yesterday, that tough issues still require to be resolved. Perhaps they will prove to be incapable of resolution, though we must all hope that that is not the case. But I believe we can see enough about the potential shape of any possible deal, should it emerge, to draw some conclusions at this stage and set out an alternative way forward. That is why the Scottish Government is publishing a further document today ahead of this week's EU Council, setting out again the case for compromise and common sense. Now, I make no apology for the fact that on many issues it reaffirms our existing position. After all, the Scottish Government's analysis over the past 2 years has largely been vindicated by events. Firstly, and very importantly, we still believe that continued membership of the EU would be the best outcome for both Scotland and the rest of the UK. Secondly, failing continued EU membership, we think that the UK as a whole should remain in both the customs union and the single market. Thirdly, if the UK Government is determined to pursue a more distant relationship with Europe, we have argued for 2 years now, reflecting, of course, the strong Remain vote in Scotland, that there should be the possibility of a differentiated approach which allows Scotland to remain in the European single market. And on that point, let me be clear in relation to Northern Ireland that we fully support the Good Friday Agreement and the maintenance of an invisible border. And so the SNP will do nothing to stand in the way of Northern Ireland achieving a special relationship to the EU if that is what is required. However, if that is the outcome, and I must stress this point, the case for Scotland having a similar arrangement to avoid us being placed at a severe economic disadvantage becomes even stronger. And fourthly and finally, given that none of these compromise options are guaranteed, we believe that when there is greater clarity about the terms of Brexit than exists today, Scotland must have the option to choose a different course as an independent member of the EU. Now, all of these points are important, but today, because of the critical stage we are reaching in the UK's negotiations with Europe, I want to focus in particular on the second of them. I will set out why, if the UK is determined to leave the EU, it should, in my view, remain in the customs union and single market. That, in my view, is the least damaging alternative option for the UK as a whole, as well as the least damaging option for Scotland. To make that point, I will first of all highlight the fact that the current option being pursued by the UK Government, the so-called Chequers proposal, is impractical, undesirable and undeliverable, and that whatever it is that the House of Commons comes to vote on later this year, it will not be the Chequers proposal. Indeed, if a withdrawal agreement can be reached, it will in all likelihood be accompanied by a very vague, probably highly fudged political declaration on the future relationship between the UK and the EU. It is my strong view that such a deal should be rejected, not in favour of no deal, as some will try to suggest, but as a way of getting a better deal back on the table. So I will then set out what I think is the real choice that the UK Government should be talking about, the trade-offs between a free trade agreement similar to the one that the EU has with Canada or continued membership of the Single Market and Customs Union. And of those, Customs Union and Single Market membership is by some considerable distance the better option. And finally, and I'm well aware that this is the most difficult part of all, I will set out my thinking on how this option might yet be achievable, indeed why it might actually be the only option capable of commanding a House of Commons majority, and why the moment for getting to this decision could be emerging. But let me begin with the UK Government's current position. As most people here know, the UK and the EU are currently negotiating on two issues. The first, of course, is the withdrawal agreement. Now, there are a number of issues there that still require resolution, including governance arrangements and geographic indicators, an issue that is extremely important to Scotland. However, as everybody knows, the most vexed issue that needs to be resolved is how to maintain an open border on the island of Ireland. And of course, without a withdrawal agreement, there will be no transition period. And let me say at this stage, just as an aside, that I hope the withdrawal agreement, if it can be concluded, includes provision to extend the transition period beyond the end of 2020. If the last 2 years have shown us anything, it is surely that more time will inevitably be needed to agree the future relationship, and so being able to extend the transition period will be absolutely vital to avoid another cliff edge scenario. Second issue, of course, under negotiation is the political declaration that will accompany the withdrawal agreement. That will set out the framework that will determine the long-term relationship between the UK and the EU. And the long-term relationship is what I want to focus on today. At the moment, the UK Government persists in saying that that should be based on the Chequers proposal, but there are no grounds whatsoever for believing that that will happen. And I think it is worth being crystal clear about this. When the EU rejected the Chequers proposals at Salzburg last month, the Prime Minister's subsequent statement tried to give the impression that some sort of ambush had taken place, that the rejection of these proposals was a complete shock. But anybody who was surprised by the substance of what was said at Salzburg can't have been paying very much attention to what the EU had been saying up until then. Indeed, that lack of attention in itself might provide a clue as to why the negotiations have been going quite so badly over recent months. And indeed, we see a similar phenomenon at play today, with the UK Government expressing surprise at positions that have been articulated and held by the European Union now for quite some time. The UK Government this morning expressing surprise that it is being held to a Northern Ireland backstop that it signed up to in December of last year. And you know, one of the casualties, and again this is an aside, but it is perhaps an important one, one of the casualties of this whole saga may actually prove to be the UK's international reputation as a trusted, reliable, good faith partner and negotiator, and that would indeed, I think, be tragic. However, Salzburg, even if it might have come as a shock to some, was useful, I think, in one way. The UK Government has been trying to say that the only possible choices the UK has are the Chequers proposal or no deal at all. Salzburg showed beyond any reasonable doubt that that is simply not correct. It's incorrect because the EU was never likely to accept some of the key elements of Chequers. Chequers relies on the UK collecting tariffs on the EU's behalf through an untried set of bureaucratic and technological processes, and that formulation, I think, has been kind to the proposals. Even more fundamentally, by keeping free movement for goods but not for services or people, Chequers undermines the essential unity of the single market, and that has always been unacceptable to the EU. In addition, Chequers would be deeply damaging to the UK and indeed to the Scottish economy. I've just mentioned that it takes services out of the single market, and it's worth just dwelling on that point for a second. Services constitute 4/5 of the UK's economy and 2/5 of its exports going to the EU. The UK has a trade deficit with the EU in goods, but it has a trade surplus in services. Now, all of that means it makes absolutely no sense at all for us to leave the single market in services. It's a market that brings huge benefits and also has enormous potential for growth in the future. And finally, Chequers is unworkable because even if it was acceptable to the EU, which it's not, there appears to be no political majority for it at home. And yet the Prime Minister, even after Salzburg, maintains that Chequers is the, and I'm quoting her here, the only serious and credible option on the table. However, it is not a serious and credible option, and the only reason it's the only option on the table is because the UK Government has refused to countenance any others. But let's be clear, and we should be clear about this. A head-in-the-sand approach will not make the Chequers ostrich fly. And so when it comes to a vote in the Commons later this year, it will not be Chequers that MPs are voting on. Now, of course, as of today, it remains to be seen if a withdrawal agreement can be reached. Alarmingly, it does seem increasingly doubtful that any deal can be struck that will satisfy both the EU27 and those in the DUP and the Brexiteer wing of her own party that the Prime Minister is politically beholden to. If no withdrawal agreement is reached, the need to change course becomes all the more necessary and certainly all the more urgent. However, if a withdrawal agreement can be struck, I would expect the political declaration on the future relationship, due to follow thereafter, to lack precise detail, leaving both sides to interpret it in the way that suits them, but with no one knowing what it actually means, and with all of the hard issues that have defied resolution in the last 2 years simply being kicked into the long grass. That then raises the quite grim prospect of the UK leaving the EU next March with no idea whatsoever of what the future relationship will be. That scenario, often referred to as a blindfold Brexit, is in my view completely unacceptable. It would replace a no-deal Brexit with a no-detail Brexit. It would keep the public and businesses in the dark. It would leave the long-term position with the Irish border unresolved. It would require the House of Commons to vote on whether to accept a deal, despite there being no way of knowing what that deal will lead to in reality. And by delaying key decisions until after the UK has left the EU, the government will reduce its influence and diminish its status just before conducting the most important negotiations in its post-war history. And the cliff edge, no-deal scenario, would not be avoided, it will simply be deferred. In my estimation, no responsible government should contemplate such a course of action. But this government is contemplating it, and its tactics are extremely clear. They will present with ever-increasing levels of desperation a completely false choice. The idea that the only alternative to a bad deal of the blindfold nature is no deal at all. It's actually quite breathtaking when you stop to consider that just for a second. The UK government has spent the last 2 years asserting that no deal is better than a bad deal, but they will almost certainly now try to railroad MPs into accepting a bad deal on the grounds that no deal will be a catastrophe. They're threatening us with fire to try to make us choose the frying pan. But MPs do not have to fall for that false choice, and I would argue that no self-respecting Parliament would fall for that false choice. The fact is that other options are available. The single market and customs union option that I have consistently argued for and will set out again today is one such option. A so-called People's Vote, which I've said SNP MPs would support, even although it wouldn't necessarily protect Scotland from the same outcome as in 2016, is another such option. These alternative options, of course, may require more time and therefore may well necessitate a request to extend Article 50. But that surely must be preferable to pressing ahead in a reckless and damaging manner. And actually, that is the key point I want to make and indeed to stress this morning. Voting against a bad or a blindfold Brexit deal isn't a vote for no deal. It would be a vote for a better deal. Indeed, voting against a bad blindfold Brexit when the opportunity arises, if it does later this year, is the only chance the House of Commons will have to reset these negotiations and to think again before it is too late. In doing so, it would finally prompt an honest and open discussion about the real long-term choice that the UK faces if it is intent on leaving the EU and the genuine trade-offs that it involves. The hard fact is that leaving the EU, and this has actually been the case from the very start of this process, ultimately involves a choice between a Canada-style free trade agreement, which would be even more damaging than Chequers because it would make trade in goods more difficult, or, on the other hand, membership of the single market and customs union. And that reality has to bite sooner or later. The head of the CBI spoke about a Canada-style agreement just a few weeks ago. She pointed out that it would be the first trade deal in history that increased barriers to trade rather than reduced them. It would lead to job losses. It would not solve the Irish border issue. By contrast, membership of the Single Market and Customs Union would end the current impasse in negotiations. It would guarantee an open border both on Ireland and across the Irish Sea, and it would be by far the better option for exporters of goods and services. Yes, it would enable continued free movement for workers, which, again, in the interests of complete transparency, is, in my view, both good and necessary, as it gives opportunities to individuals in Scotland and the UK to work overseas and allows businesses and public services to recruit from across the continent. But it would also still enable the UK to apply existing restrictions on rights of movement for people who aren't choosing to work or study. So for all of these reasons, it is by far the least damaging form of Brexit for the economy. And for Scotland, and I know for many others across these islands, it also speaks much more strongly to our European identity, to our desire to be a constructive partner to our neighbours across the continent. And although, as someone who voted Remain, I see single market and customs union membership as being second best to membership of the EU, for many people who voted to leave, it would surely be preferable to EU membership. The UK would, after all, have left the EU. There would be no sense of being part of a growing political union. The UK would no longer have to be part of the common agricultural and fisheries policies. And although divergence from EU rules and regulations would certainly have consequences, this approach would leave Westminster with the final say in whether particular single market rules applied here in the UK. Now, in saying all of this, I am acutely aware that so far the UK government has been consistent in its rejection of membership of the single market and customs union. But that's for two related reasons, neither of which stand up to much scrutiny. The first is that it has established red lines in these negotiations, such as ending free movement of people and being able to sign independent trade deals. But these red lines contradict some of its other stated positions. In particular, the further away from Europe we are in terms of immigration and trade policy, the harder it will be to keep the Irish border open. And of course, the red lines themselves are completely self-imposed. They are not essential consequences of the referendum. Indeed, as I recall, the ability to sign trade deals was hardly an issue in the referendum. And that, I think, is an important point, because the second reason the UK government gives for its current stance is democratic legitimacy. The Prime Minister said after Salzburg that single market membership would make a mockery of the referendum. But in 2016, the winning side was not obliged to put forward a clear proposal. It put forward no proposal other than the famous lie on the side of the bus. So the referendum outcome was not a mandate for a hard Brexit. In fact, I would go further than that. It told us nothing about what sort of Brexit people might want. If it had done, it surely wouldn't have taken the UK government more than 2 years to even come up with the Chequers proposal. And, of course, in addition to that, 48% of voters voted to remain in the EU, so did 2 out of the 4 nations of the UK. So in that context, membership of the Single Market and Customs Union is surely the obvious democratic compromise. It is certainly, in my opinion, a better reflection of the referendum outcome than anything the UK government has so far proposed. Indeed, what is happening at the moment is quite extraordinary. The UK government is ploughing on with a strategy that it knows will reduce household incomes and cost jobs. It has appointed a Minister for Food Supplies, for goodness sake, for the first time since the Second World War. Its own departmental notices are setting out plans to stockpile medicines. On Friday, it announced that the M26 was being adapted for use as a lorry park. It's having to do all of this only because it has chosen an extreme interpretation of the referendum result, while overlooking the obvious fact that whatever most people voted for, it surely wasn't where we are right now. Now, that stance, in my view, is the one, actually, that makes a mockery not just of the referendum result, but of basic common sense. It's not justified on democratic grounds, and it should not be countenanced on economic grounds. But of course, in many ways, diagnosing these issues and these problems is relatively straightforward. The harder part is answering the fundamental question, where do we go from here? After all, the Prime Minister and her government's rhetoric over the last 2 years has put it in a tight, awkward position. Any move now to accept single market and customs union membership is likely to be seen as a climb down rather than a compromise. I understand that, but fundamentally that is a problem of the government's own making. It should not and must not stand in the way of the wider public interest. And of course, in the weeks ahead, it won't simply be the government that has to make important decisions. A heavy responsibility, a very heavy responsibility, will also rest with Parliament and with individual MPs. For MPs to support a bad or a blindfold Brexit, a cobbled-together withdrawal agreement and a vague statement about our future relationship would, in my view, be a real dereliction of duty. So what happens then if they reject that and instead force an honest discussion about a Canada-style deal or continued free trade and customs union membership? Well, it seems to me impossible, absolutely impossible, to envisage a Westminster majority for a Canada-style deal. The Labour Party has said that it would vote against such an outcome. The SNP certainly would. A few weeks ago, Amber Rudd said that 40 Tory MPs would vote against that outcome as well. In fact, in these circumstances, it is probably the case that the only option with any chance of commanding a parliamentary majority is single market and customs union membership. Now, I'm not saying at all that the way to such a solution would be easy, but it actually might well be the only option which is not completely impossible at this stage. It should be acceptable to the European Union. It avoids the worst economic damage that Brexit will do. It resolves the Irish border issue, and it does come closest to reconciling the different views of leavers and remainers. And while it is an outcome that might still look some distance away, it is not unachievable. What it requires is common sense and a willingness to compromise. And it's worth adding at this point that a willingness to compromise when it comes to the UK government cannot simply be an attempt to find the centre of gravity between the most vocal elements of the Tory party, or even between the Tory party and the DUP. It must instead be a genuine attempt to find some common ground across what is currently a divided Parliament and a divided UK. Now, I'm prepared to play my part in that. After all, I am First Minister of a country which voted by 62% to 38% to remain in the EU. However, as we have made clear for 2 years now, the Scottish Government, albeit with a heavy heart, would support an outcome that secures continued membership of the Single Market and Customs Union. In short, we have long demonstrated our willingness to compromise, and I think it's time that the UK Government did likewise. And as the crucial vote looms closer, it is also time for individual members of the House of Commons to consider what compromises they see as justified and which are not, if they are to serve their constituents and the wider public interest. If they do that, I do believe that a common-sense outcome could yet be found. There is one final point I want to make. I mentioned earlier on that this room evokes Scotland's historic connections with Europe. It highlights the fact that Scotland is and always has been a European nation. Indeed, our European identity has strengthened in recent years. Next month marks the 20th anniversary of the passage of the Scotland Act, which paved the way for devolution and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. And when that Act was being debated at Westminster, Donald Dewar, Scotland's First Minister, predicted that devolution would add a new dimension to Scotland's role in Europe. And his words have been proven to be absolutely right. In the past 20 years, Scotland, with the support of all political parties at Holyrood, has expanded its presence in Brussels. We have collaborated with partners on European projects, from renewable energy to healthy ageing. Our businesses and our universities have enjoyed ever greater benefits from our international ties. Scottish society has been enriched by the presence of more than 230,000 EU citizens from outside the UK. We've seen at first hand the benefits we gain from working with allies from across the continent. And so we are determined to work to enhance rather than diminish our ties with the EU. In the past 2 years alone, the Scottish Government has established new offices in Berlin, Dublin and Paris, here in London as well. Our enterprise agency has doubled its representation in Europe. And so even if the UK Government does opt for a hard Brexit, I'm determined that Scotland will do everything we can to ensure that our policies remain consistent with European priorities and values. You see, the basic ideal behind the EU, for all its imperfections, appeals to us. We like the idea of independent nations cooperating closely for the common good. And as we watch the Brexit fiasco unfold, the case for Scotland becoming one of those independent nations becomes ever stronger. But of course, whatever happens, we will always, first and foremost, seek to work closely and constructively with other nations on these islands. It is in all of our interests that we find a better approach to Brexit, one which avoids the worst economic harms of a hard Brexit and maintains the key benefits of free trade and the other ties that unite countries across Europe. If we can help to deliver that common sense Brexit, we believe it will be the best or perhaps the least bad outcome, not just for Scotland, but for the UK and indeed for the whole of Europe. My hope, even now, is that such an outcome might still be in reach, and the Scottish Government will do everything we can to help achieve it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for a very powerful speech. There was quite a strong moral dimension to your speech. You talked about responsibility, the need for compromise. You talked about the wider public interest. Now, in a sense, where we are is the consequence of the fact that in the end, 2 years ago, we as a country, as the UK, voted for something without fully knowing the consequences and without actually being in control of those consequences. And in many ways, opinion has polarised further since. So this is a very difficult, a very almost intractable position we find ourselves in. And yet, playing into this difficulty, this incredible difficulty, there are other concerns. There may be senior Conservatives for whom these questions are in some ways connected to their own personal ambitions to be leaders of the Conservative Party. There is the Labour Party's clear desire to try to engineer an outcome in terms of a general election. People in your own party, you mentioned at the end of your own speech, for whom independence is the ultimate goal. I guess my question is this: is this issue resolvable if people are trying to use it also as a way of furthering an alternative agenda, given how incredibly difficult it is to solve in the first place?
No, if people insist on prioritising their own personal agendas, then I fear these issues will not be capable of resolution. Now, I'm not naive, I'm a politician. People will have their own agendas. I'm not going to shock anybody here when I say I'm a politician that believes strongly in EU membership. I'm a politician that has spent my entire life campaigning and arguing for Scottish independence. So, these are views I hold very strongly. But there comes a time in politics where you've got to try to find where the common ground is, rather than always talking about the things that we disagree around. And from my perspective, yes, I want Scotland to be independent. I think the last 2 years have, as I said a moment ago, strengthened the case for Scotland to be independent. But even if Scotland becomes independent in the next few years, it will still be in our interests that the rest of the UK, our closest friends and allies, have a good relationship with the European Union and remain close in trading in other terms to the European Union. So I don't want to see any part of the UK take a step that I consider would be deeply damaging for a long time to come. So it's possible to have your own interests and priorities, but also see the bigger picture. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not pretending I've got all the answers, or that some people will not suspect ulterior motive on my part. That's life. But we desperately need to find some way of discussing what the compromise and common ground might be. And for all the reasons I've set out, while there will be arguments that can be made against single market and customs union membership, economically, democratically, socially, politically, it seems to me to be the obvious ground for potential compromise. And as I said also, it may become more than that. It may actually be the only option that has any chance of commanding a majority here.
So in a way, the irony is that on the one hand, it feels as though the stakes are incredibly high and the position is a dangerous one. On the other hand, it can sometimes feel like what we're seeing is the kind of playing out of an inevitable process. An inevitable process which results in, and I would have been surprised that a deal had been done before the very last moment. My assumption has always been a deal is done at the very last moment as we stare over the precipice, the fat is pulled out of the fire, the Prime Minister returns, the European Union says, well, we have given last-minute concessions. And at that point, with a deal which may well have the characteristics you've described, a blindfold Brexit, no detail Brexit, in the end, everybody then says duly, well, we could have got a better deal. You will say, I could have got a better deal. The Labour, we could have got a better. Boris Johnson will say, I could have got. Everyone says, well, we could have got a better. But in the end, we kind of go there, and we do sustain some kind of customs union, single market arrangement for the next few years, and hope that in some ways the position is diffused, and we can kick the can along the road. Am I wrong in thinking that this is almost inevitably the outcome?
I'm not going to sit here and say you're absolutely wrong. You may turn out to be right. I'm not convinced you are, though, and I guess time will tell. There is a school of thought that what happened yesterday is part of a carefully choreographed process that will see both sides stick to their positions, and then both sides give ground, and suddenly a deal will emerge. Now, it may well be that to have the best chance of getting a deal this week was too early to have that crystallise. And it may be, as somebody who knows a fair amount about how these processes can work, I would not find it impossible to believe that that was at play. Equally, I think it would be dreadfully complacent at this stage to assume that's what's at play, because when you look carefully at what is separating the UK and the EU right now, these are real substantive issues that just may not be possible to reconcile. Ireland rightly has been given guarantees that the border issues will be dealt with. The easiest way to do that is to keep the UK in a customs union long term, not just temporarily. The even easier way would be to keep it in the single market as well. But to a certain grouping within the Tory party and to the DUP as well, when it comes to Northern Ireland's position, these things are anathema. And you've got people with very, very fixed views. And you know, the final point well, two final points I would make is, in this process thus far, the side that has at every crunch point given ground is the UK. And I just wonder if Theresa May is running out of the room to be able to do that, because the deal that would allow her to do with the EU may just then be one that is incapable of getting through the House of Commons. My final point is, in my sort of plea for compromise, what I think it's important we don't do is agree something that is the worst of all worlds just in order to avoid no deal. Let's, if what comes back from Brussels is a cobbled together hodgepodge deal, or more likely a deal where all of the issues are just kicked into the long grass, let's grasp that as an opportunity to get something that makes more sense back on the table, would be my view.
And the final question for me before we open it up. I mean, I grew up in a politics which kind of assumed that if you could find a compromise, it would be the most popular option. We're not in that world now in politics. Around the world, we're not in that world. The people who say who speak of moderation and compromise as being virtues in politics are the ones who are tending to lose elections hands down to those who have a very different view of the world. I'm interested if you were to get the outcome which you argue for. Implicit in your view, in fact you said it, explicit, is that the Brexit supporters are satisfied because we are no longer formally legally within the European Union, and the Remain supporters are satisfied because we have a highly attenuated form of Brexit and we maintain the benefits of the customs union or the single market. There is, of course, an alternative view. An alternative view is that Remainers feel dismayed because we are rule takers, not rule makers, and they have lost the relationship to the European Union. And Brexiteers feel that they have been profoundly shortchanged because we are not in charge in anything like the way that they envisage when they use phrases like take back control. Why are you confident that a compromise here leads to a kind of process of healing and moving on, rather than in a deeper polarisation?
I think that's a good question, and I don't think anybody, me included, can be 100% sure of that. But you know, outside of the sort of extremes in this debate, I suspect the majority of people right across the UK just want to see the thing move on and want to see something emerge that makes sense and will not make everybody poorer, you know, cost jobs and do real and lasting damage to the economy. So that makes me think that a compromise would actually be more popular than perhaps people assume that it would be. The point about being a rule taker, I mean, you go as I have done and speak to people in Iceland or Norway, countries that are within the EEA but not in the European Union. These countries don't see themselves as rule takers. Actually, on the contrary, they see themselves as having significant influence in terms of the rules. So I don't necessarily take that view. What I think would be inevitable, if you take Chequers, the UK will end up in the most egregious rule-taking position with no influence either in the EEA or the EU, but having to accept all of the sort of EU regulations in reality in order to keep that sort of close to frictionless trade that the Prime Minister asserts that would lead to. So my view, there are no certainties in this, but the alternative possibly now is a crashing out with no deal situation, or taking the step off the cliff edge next March before anybody really knows what lies ahead. And that to me seems, either of those options seem to me to not be sensible at all, if I can put it as mildly as that. So let's try and go for the compromise, and let's let politicians, leaders lead and actually try to, I mean, immigration's a good example of where I think politicians, my own profession, have been woefully negligent in how this debate has transpired, where a referendum result was arguably delivered on the back of a debate about immigration that was not rooted particularly in fact and reality. So sometimes politicians have a duty to lead and try to persuade people that a particular option is the right one, and now is such a moment.
Right, I think in the time we've got remaining, I'm going to try to take 3 questions from our friends from the press, who are gathered over there. We've not kind of put you in a special place because we're worried about you in any particular way, but just so I know where you are. And then we're going to take, if we can, 3 questions from members of the audience in general. So let me start with in the kind of corner there. Yeah.
Thank you. First Minister Nick Eardley, BBC. If you vote down the Prime Minister's deal, many on the other side would also see that as an opportunity to get what they want from this process, a harder Brexit. So do you accept that voting that down is a risk, and it could mean that the UK ends up crashing out in a way which would be much harder than what you'd be voting down?
I tried to cover that in my speech. I look at the arithmetic in the House of Commons, which everybody is capable of doing, and I do not see, whichever way I try to cut it, I do not see a majority for a harder Brexit or the Canada-style agreement that the likes of Boris Johnson argues for. I do see not an inevitable majority, not necessarily an easy majority, but I can see a majority in these circumstances for single market and customs union. So what I do think is most important at this stage is that MPs do not allow themselves effectively to be blackmailed into this idea that if they don't vote for whatever the Prime Minister brings back, if she brings back anything at all, then it's inevitably no deal. I think that's got to be resisted. That framing of this decision has to be resisted, because that's the moment, the only moment perhaps, that the House of Commons has to take control of this and get it onto a better track. And once it gets it onto a different track, as I said, I don't see the majority for the harder Brexit. I do see the possibility of a majority for the customs union single market.
You say it's a possibility, so there's still the possibility something else, potentially something that you would see as worse, could happen. I don't see the majority for that in the House of Commons, but at the moment, the risk that's faced right now is no deal or the no detail deal, and both of those are risks that are not, in my view, worth taking. So this is the moment to try to get something better. And as I say, as I look at the majority in the House of Commons, it makes me optimistic that the something better is far more able to command that majority than the harder Brexit that you pose as a risk.
So, woman there in the...
Thank you. Pippa Carrera from The Guardian. I was struck, Nicola, by what you're saying about MPs, calling on MPs of all parties to consider what compromises they see as justified and which they're not when it comes to voting on a final Brexit deal. But given the reality of where we are now today, rather than where you might prefer to end up as a party, is there anything that Number 10 or the PM could talk to you about or realistically offer you as a party to get their support in the House, to get your support in the House of Commons?
Single market and customs union membership. That's, but that, what I think people...
Now, is it? I mean, given where we are today.
But if you listen to what I said, I think there is a path from where we are today to that. And if we don't, if we don't accept that, then we might as well all just sit back and say, well, we'll crash out, and I'm not prepared to do that. And the point I would make for those who might be listening to me saying that and saying, well, that sounds like a hardline position, for me, that is a compromise. The country I'm First Minister of voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. So something short of that, for me, is a big compromise. And we've been consistent now since the paper we published in December 2016 that is our bottom line. I and SNP MPs could not vote for something that doesn't at least deliver that. We'd be betraying the vote of the people of the country we represent. But that's where I think the compromise is there to be found, if people are prepared to come off of fixed positions, as we have done, and talk about that in earnest.
Good morning, Antonello Guerrera from La Repubblica, Italy. I just would like to ask you, if there is a hard Brexit, no deal case, how realistic is a referendum on Scottish independence? And also,
That's quite a big question in itself.
But with regard to this, one thing that I believe is that the context will be much different from the previous referendum that we had. So it would be a right decision for you, and how realistic it is. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a good and very relevant question. I have given a commitment that when we get to the end of this phase of negotiations, which I think a few months ago we all thought would be in October. It now looks as if it may be November or sometime around that. I will at that stage set out my views on the next steps for Scotland. In other words, when I think Scotland should consider again the option of independence, and that's what I will do, and I'll set out my views on that at that stage. Beyond that, what I would say, and this I say from a whole different range of perspectives, the case for independence, particularly the democratic case for independence since 2014 has strengthened immeasurably. In 2014, for those who followed the Scottish independence referendum, one of the key issues at the heart of that referendum was Scotland's membership of the European Union, where the campaign against Scottish independence made great play of the fact that if Scotland voted yes, we'd get thrown out of the European Union. We wouldn't be allowed to be members, and yet here we are 4 years later, and we face being taken out of the European Union against our will. And that really brings to the fore and brings into sharp focus the democratic deficit within the UK that Scotland has experienced on many occasions, but particularly on this issue has felt particularly harshly.
We're going to turn to this side of the room now. I'm sure that, Nicola, your staff will be willing to speak to other journalists after the event is over. But let me take some questions from other parts of the room. So what I'll do is I'll take 3 together, if that's all right, and then you could answer those and we can then wind up. So, yeah.
Hello. As a proud Englishman but an avid Remainer, which extends to Scotland remaining within the United Kingdom.
Sorry, tell us your name.
Oh, Jeremy Kaplan, and I'm a fellow here. My question, though, is if you wanted to be just a little bit cynical, the drive for continuous membership of the customs union, etc., that you're putting forward, solves the biggest issue Scotland would face in independence, which is you don't end up with the Irish border situation at Berwick and Carlisle. Because when Britain, UK, has whatever other type of Brexit that comes along apart from that one, what is the solution for a country like Scotland, which has 80% of its trade with the rest of the United Kingdom?
Okay, thank you for that. Who's next? Yep.
Yes, my name is Christian de Wartevan. I'm a Remainer too, but one question I could have asked Mrs. May if she was there. If you would have him, if Scotland would be independent, have you made any plans to project the country in the future? To project the country, to bring the country forward in the future, plans to develop the economy, etc.
That's a very big question. I suspect the answer is yes. I'd be rather surprised if it wasn't. Are there any women who want to ask questions from this side of the room? The answer to that question appears to be no. Yes, very good, thank you.
Excellent. Assuming things go badly, either no deal or a no detail deal, what are you going to do about it? Practically, actually, it would be good to know what the next immediate steps will be.
Great. 3 questions for you.
Okay. I would not want anybody to be remotely cynical about any of this, but you're right. Customs union and single market membership would be, of the whole of the UK, would be, in my view, good for the UK. It would also be the best option should Scotland become independent, including for the reasons you talk about. If that doesn't happen and Scotland becomes independent in other circumstances, then we will require, as will be the case with Ireland, to look at solutions to make sure that trade can stay free between Scotland and the rest of the UK, because that market is important to us, just as the Scottish market is important to the rest of the UK. But of course, one of the frustrations for me, and I think for Scotland as a whole, is this notion that we should be forced to choose between trade with the rest of the UK and trade with the single market, which is 8 times bigger than the rest of the UK. And increasingly, Scotland's focus is on growing our international exports across the UK and further afield. So staying within the single market and customs union, I think for a whole variety of different options, is the best outcome for Scotland, whatever our constitutional status, and for the UK as a whole. Yes, is the answer to that question. Right now, Scotland, the devolved government of Scotland is, as I touched on in my remarks, working as hard as we can to promote and project ourselves across Europe. It is hugely important to us. Brexit notwithstanding, Scotland's got a big need to increase our exports and are increasing our exports. We've got the fastest export growth of any nation in the UK. So we're doing a lot of work just now to project Scotland's reputation and all of the wonderful goods and services that we can export across the EU and indeed across the world. In terms of your question, what do we do about it? It's a good question. I don't sit here and say I have all of the answers. Right now, the Scottish Government is, as far as we can, doing very detailed, in some areas, granular preparation for the possibility of no deal to try to protect the Scottish economy as much as possible. That's not an easy task, particularly when we're not in the driving seat of some of these decisions. We will continue to do that planning. We will continue to plan for every eventuality. And of course, as I said in response to an earlier question, when we get to the end of this phase of negotiations, I'll set out my views on particular next steps for Scotland in the context of independence.
So I'm afraid we've run out of time. We're going to have to wrap up the session now. Thank you all for coming. Apologies to those whose questions I didn't take, and thank you for the questions that you asked. Just to say personally that I think if we are going to progress from the incredibly difficult position that we're in, it is going to require people to balance political opportunism with a sense of responsibility and duty to the public interest. And given that that was such a strong theme in your speech, we're very proud that you gave that speech here. So please join me once again in thanking First Minister Nicola Sturgeon.